New York City, 1931. Smoke curls from the chimneys of tenement rooftops. The streets hum with jazz, rumble with bootleg trucks, and bleed with ambition. The Great Depression has turned the American dream into a desperate gamble, and for the men who rule the shadows, respect is the only currency that matters. Beneath the glittering lights of Times Square and the blood-soaked docks of the Hudson, one name is whispered with reverence and fear alike: Lucky Luciano. To the public, he's a ghost, a myth stitched together from headlines and rumors. To the underworld, he's the architect of order, the man who transformed chaos into empire. This story begins not with power but with survival. Luciano's world is one where immigrants scrape for dignity, where respect is more valuable than money, and where every handshake hides a blade. He wasn't born into the Mafia, he built it. From the dirty corners of Manhattan's Lower East Side, he would rise through cunning, brutality, and charm, the trinity that defined his legend. Yet what drove him wasn't greed. It was something deeper, almost tragic. The hunger to be respected in a country that saw him as nothing more than another street rat from Sicily. The 1920s were an age of contradictions: prohibition and prosperity, jazz and violence, politics and corruption intertwined. America was drunk on its own modernity, but in its alleys, another nation was being born. One ruled not by presidents or policemen, but by men of silence, by men of honor. The Mafia was changing, but it didn't yet know it. The old bosses, the so-called mustache Petes, ruled by the ancient Sicilian code, demanding obedience, speaking only their native tongue, and scorning the young generation who dreamed in English. Luciano was one of those dreamers. He looked around and saw inefficiency, arrogance, and waste. The old men clung to tradition. He saw opportunity. As America modernized, Luciano realized that crime too could evolve. He didn't want to rule the streets, he wanted to organize them. He saw the Mafia not as a family but as an enterprise. Every racket, from gambling dens to prostitution rings, could operate like a business, with leadership, profit-sharing, and rules. But to make that dream real, he'd need to wage a quiet war, not for money or territory but for something far more dangerous: respect. Respect in the Mafia world wasn't given. It was taken, earned in blood and fear. For Luciano, it became both obsession and identity. Every betrayal, every risk, every death around him traced back to that one idea. Respect was survival. Respect was immortality. Yet the higher he climbed, the more fragile it became, because in the underworld, respect lasts only as long as power does. This documentary isn't just about Lucky Luciano's rise and fall. It's about what he represented: a new kind of criminal mind, modern, strategic, and ruthless. He didn't just change the Mafia, he changed how power itself worked in America. The mob would no longer be a cluster of feuding clans, but a network of businessmen who wore suits instead of vendetta scars. Luciano gave the Mafia structure, purpose, and vision, but he also gave it something darker: the illusion of legitimacy. As we journey through his life, from the back alleys of the Lower East Side to the courtrooms that would define his fate, we'll see a man torn between two worlds: the immigrant and the king, the visionary and the criminal. We'll peel back the layers of myth to find the psychology beneath. A man who understood people like chess pieces, who knew that fear could command loyalty, and that respect could outlive bullets. Every empire begins with a dream, and ends with a reckoning. For Luciano, the dream was to be respected not just as a gangster, but as a man who made history. Yet history has its own rules. It forgets the faces of the kings, but it remembers the kingdoms they built, and the blood they spilled to build them. So, as the camera drifts over the glowing skyline of old New York, we step into a story that's as much about America as it is about the Mafia. A story of power born from desperation, of modernity forged in violence. This is not just the tale of Lucky Luciano's empire, it's the story of the war for respect that defined him, and the world he left behind. Before Luciano there was chaos, a world ruled not by strategy but by pride. New York's underworld at the dawn of the 20th century was a living map of fear and fragmentation. Dozens of small gangs, each guarding their turf like feudal lords, ran the streets. From the docks of Brooklyn to the crowded markets of Mulberry Street, power changed hands with every knife fight and gunshot. This was the world of the mustache Petes, the old Sicilian dons who carried the traditions of their homeland like sacred scripture. To them, America was not a land of opportunity, it was foreign soil, a temporary exile. They refused to adapt, to speak English, or to trust anyone not born on Sicilian ground. Their rule was built on ritual and suspicion. A man's loyalty was judged by his accent, his birthplace, and his silence. They called it omerta, the code of silence. Breaking it meant death. These old dons operated like tribal chiefs, dividing cities into invisible borders and keeping their soldiers poor to ensure obedience. They despised the flashy new generation, men who wore suits, spoke English and mixed with Jews and Irishmen. In their eyes this new breed lacked honor. In reality they were the future. The old Mafia's strength was in secrecy, but its weakness was in arrogance. It saw itself as an imported hierarchy, not an American enterprise. While the world around them modernized, telephones, automobiles, speakeasies, the Mustache Pete's still handled disputes with whispered insults and back-alley executions. Their leadership was based not on intelligence or innovation, but on heritage and brutality. The underworld reflected the disunity of the old country, fragmented families, endless vendettas, no shared vision beyond survival. At the same time, America was undergoing a transformation. The 1910s and 1920s brought waves of immigrants, Italians, Jews, Irish, Germans, all crammed into overcrowded slums, all chasing the same dream, respectability. But when the doors of industry and politics were closed to them, many turned to the shadows. Crime wasn't just rebellion, it was survival. Prohibition, introduced in 1920, turned that survival into empire. The law outlawed liquor, but demand didn't die, it simply changed hands. The streets became the arteries of an underground economy, and the gangs became its lifeblood. Yet even in this booming black market, the old mafia bosses couldn't adapt. They treated bootlegging like another feud, not a business. Instead of uniting under a common goal, they sabotaged one another, killing competitors instead of collaborating with them. Money flowed freely, but so did blood. The police were overwhelmed, politicians were bought, newspapers romanticized the violence. The American public was fascinated, crime was theater and the gangsters were its stars. But behind the spectacle, a quiet revolution was brewing. Younger mobsters, many of them American-born, saw the futility of endless wars. They understood the language of the streets and the boardroom alike. They wore tailored suits, went to jazz clubs and built alliances across ethnic lines. To them, profit mattered more than pride, efficiency more than tradition. At their center stood a young man named Charlie Luciano, street-smart, multilingual and dangerously ambitious. Unlike the Mustache Pete's, he wasn't chained to the past. He didn't see the Mafia as an Italian brotherhood. He saw it as an American institution waiting to be built. The world before Luciano was one where men died for insults, not ideas. Dons ruled from dark rooms, their word carried by fear, not respect. They demanded obedience but offered no future. Their power ended the moment a younger, hungrier man appeared. There was no organization, no hierarchy beyond superstition and family ties. Every boss was his own king, every soldier a pawn with a gun. Luciano watched this system and understood its flaw. It could not last. A criminal empire without structure was doomed to destroy itself. The Sicilian dons had imported honor, but they had forgotten strategy. They had brought fear but not foresight. In the new America, survival belonged to those who could evolve. Those who could think like businessmen while acting like gangsters. Luciano would become that hybrid. By the late 1920s, the streets were soaked with blood. The Castellammarese clan, led by Salvatore Maranzano, was preparing for war against Joe, the boss Masuria, the reigning don of New York. The old mafia was eating itself alive. The Mustache Pete's called it honor, Luciano saw it as waste. As the city braced for another storm of gunfire and betrayal, he began quietly positioning himself between both sides. But before he could rise, he had to survive this crumbling world, one built on suspicion, violence, and outdated codes. The world before Luciano wasn't just the backdrop of his story, it was his training ground, his education in the language of power. Every mistake the old guard made became a lesson. Every corpse on the pavement became a prophecy. Soon the old ways would die, and with them the last illusion that the Mafia was just a family of men from Sicily. Under Luciano it would become something far more dangerous, an organization. The streets that once ran on vendetta would soon run on profit. And when that transformation came, it would not be with ceremony or permission. It would be written in blood, in the silent death of the old world. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in the sunburned town of Lercara Fritti, Sicily, a place where respect and survival were the same thing. His father, Antonio, was a sulfur miner who dreamed of a better life across the Atlantic. When the Lucania family arrived in New York, they joined thousands of Italian immigrants crammed into the narrow, suffocating streets of the Lower East Side. Tenements groaned with the noise of families stacked on top of each other, alleys stank of sweat and poverty, and every corner was a reminder that America wasn't the land of opportunity, it was a battlefield. In this harsh new world, the boy who would become Lucky Luciano learned his first lesson early. Nobody gives you respect, you take it. At school he was mocked for his accent, bullied for his ragged clothes, and dismissed as another immigrant nobody. By age 10 he had already started charging other kids protection money, a few cents to keep them safe from the bullies he himself controlled. It wasn't malice, it was instinct. Even as a child, Luciano understood the mechanics of power: control the fear and you control the people. The Lower East Side in the early 1900s was a melting pot of desperation. Jewish tailors, Irish dockworkers, Italian fruit sellers, all crammed together, all fighting for scraps. The divide between legal and illegal life was thin, and survival often depended on which side you stood. Street gangs like the 5 Points Gang ruled these blocks, their members barely out of their teens but already hardened by violence. They were the first taste of organized crime in America, crude, chaotic but lethal. It was among them that young Charlie found his calling. By his mid-teens he had joined the 5 Points Gang under the infamous Johnny Torrio and his protege, Al Capone. Torrio saw in Luciano something rare, a boy who combined street cunning with vision. Luciano wasn't the strongest or the most violent, but he was the smartest. He understood people, their greed, their weaknesses, their desires. He was polite when he needed to be, brutal when he had to be, and calculating always. Torrio taught him that violence should serve business, not replace it. From Torrio, Luciano learned his most important lesson. Power built on respect lasts longer than power built on fear alone. In his late teens, Luciano began dabbling in bootlegging, gambling, and drug dealing. He made money quickly but spent it faster: silk suits, cigarettes, and women. He loved the image of success, the attention, the aura. To him, style was strategy. He realized that in America, appearances mattered as much as bloodlines. If he wanted respect, he had to look like he already had it. The Lower East Side may have seen him as another hustler, but he was already thinking bigger, beyond blocks, beyond neighborhoods, toward the entire city. Then came the moment that would define his legend, and his nickname. In 1929, Luciano was kidnapped by a rival gang, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach. Somehow he survived. His face was scarred, his smile permanently crooked, and his body a roadmap of pain. But when he reappeared in the city weeks later, people started calling him Lucky. It wasn't just luck that saved him, it was something colder, something unbreakable. The attack became a kind of baptism. Luciano understood then that his survival gave him more than fear, it gave him myth. The underworld began to see him not as a man, but as a symbol, someone chosen by fate. After the attack, Luciano's demeanor changed. He was no longer the charming street kid chasing quick money. He was focused, patient, and dangerous. He began building a circle of allies who shared his vision. Men who saw crime not as chaos but as opportunity. His closest confidant was Meyer Lansky, a Jewish kid from the same neighborhood, brilliant with numbers and ruthless in thought. Together, they formed one of the most strategic partnerships in American crime history. To the old Sicilian bosses, working with a Jew was blasphemy. To Luciano it was progress. Lansky introduced him to another ally, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a hot-headed enforcer with movie star charm and a killer's reflexes. Together, the three formed an unbreakable triangle. Luciano the strategist, Lansky the accountant, Siegel the soldier. Their friendship defied ethnicity, class, and tradition. More importantly, it represented the future. A mafia that wasn't defined by where you came from, but by what you could bring to the table. As Prohibition took hold, the opportunities multiplied. The streets turned into rivers of illegal liquor, and Luciano was at the heart of it. He built smuggling routes, bribed police, and partnered with other gangs to share profits instead of bullets. It was revolutionary, a businessman's approach to organized crime. By the mid-1920s, he was making more money than most legitimate entrepreneurs. But with every dollar earned, he drew the attention of the old guard, men who saw his success as arrogance, his innovation as betrayal. What set Luciano apart wasn't just ambition, it was adaptability. He didn't cling to one scheme or one loyalty. He moved through alliances like a chess master, always 10 steps ahead. He could share a drink with a rival one night and order his removal the next morning if it served the greater plan. It wasn't personal, it was strategy. To Luciano, sentimentality was weakness, and respect was the only emotion that mattered. Still, beneath the confidence and swagger, there was something deeper, a quiet need to prove himself. As an immigrant's son, Luciano grew up hearing Americans mock his kind, hearing politicians call them criminals and vermin. His entire rise could be read as an act of defiance, a demand that America see him, respect him, fear him. For a man born in the gutters, power wasn't just about wealth, it was about rewriting the story of where he came from. By the end of the 1920s, Luciano had evolved from a street hustler into a strategist of the underworld. He wasn't yet the boss, not officially, but he was already shaping the future. Behind his calm smile lay a ruthless mind, one that understood the greatest truth of power, that real control doesn't come from violence, but from the perception of inevitability. And as the city roared with the sound of jazz and gunfire, Luciano watched the old bosses play their games of pride and vengeance. He didn't want their crowns. He wanted something far bigger, a system that would outlive them all. Soon, the chance to seize it would come, and when it did, lucky Luciano would be ready to turn the streets of New York into his empire. By the late 1920s, Charlie Lucky Luciano had already learned how to survive, and now he was learning how to rule. The streets of New York were changing fast. Prohibition had transformed bootleggers into millionaires and street thugs into corporate-style criminals. But the Mafia itself was still chained to the past, held hostage by the Mustache Petes, the old Sicilian dons who ran their empires like medieval fiefdoms. To them, Luciano was a talented but reckless upstart, a young wolf who didn't know his place. To Luciano they were fossils, men blinded by tradition, incapable of seeing that America was no longer Sicily. Working under Joe the Boss Masuria, one of the most feared mafia leaders in New York, Luciano began to study the dynamics of power up close. Masuria was old school, brutal, paranoid, and hungry for respect. He ruled by fear, surrounded by loyalists who obeyed him out of terror, not trust. Luciano served him faithfully at first, handling bootlegging deals, gambling operations, and negotiations with other gangs. But beneath his polite obedience he was analyzing everything, every flaw, every weakness in the system. Masuria's organization, like all the others, was chaotic. There was no structure, no real strategy, just greed, violence, and a constant need to prove dominance. Luciano saw the hypocrisy of the old code. The Mustache Petes spoke of honor, but they killed for ego. They prided themselves on loyalty, but they betrayed anyone who threatened their control. They preached the Sicilian code of silence, yet their wars turned the streets into public spectacles of blood. They still refused to do business with non-Italians, cutting themselves off from enormous opportunities. To Luciano this wasn't loyalty, it was stupidity. The old ways might have worked in the hills of Palermo, but not in the skyscraper jungles of New York. He began forming quiet alliances behind Masuria's back. Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel became his trusted lieutenants, helping him run operations that reached beyond ethnic lines. Luciano built connections with Jewish and Irish syndicates, creating partnerships the old dons would never have dared to consider. He believed in what he called the combination, a cooperative network of criminal enterprises working together like departments in a company. In his vision, crime could be industrialized, efficient, scalable, and governed by logic, not pride. But his revolutionary thinking made him dangerous to the establishment. Men like Maranzano and Masuria saw him as a threat, a young man who dared to question sacred traditions. Rumors spread that Luciano was too American, too liberal with outsiders, too modern. Some whispered that he lacked omerta, the ancient code of silence and loyalty. Others feared his intelligence, the calm, patient way he observed before striking. Even within his own ranks, there were those who admired him and those who plotted against him. Luciano, meanwhile, continued to rise in influence. He became indispensable to Masuria, managing massive bootlegging operations and negotiating truces with rival gangs. The police knew his name but couldn't pin anything on him. Politicians accepted his envelopes, nightclubs welcomed his men, and the city's newspapers occasionally mentioned his parties with movie stars and businessmen. He was no longer just a gangster, he was becoming a figure of legend, a man who walked between two worlds, the street and the suite. Still, working under Masuria was suffocating. The old man demanded loyalty but offered no respect. He treated Luciano like a servant, reminding him constantly that he'd never be a true boss as long as the Mustache Petes ruled. For someone like Luciano, a man obsessed with control, that was intolerable. Yet he waited. He watched. He let the old man underestimate him. What separated Luciano from the rest of his generation was patience. Where others sought quick fame through violence, he thought in decades. He understood that power built on blood alone was temporary. What he wanted was something that would outlive him, a system, not just a name. In private conversations with Lansky, he spoke about reorganizing the entire underworld into a structure modeled after corporate America. Every family would have a defined territory, a leadership hierarchy, and a share of profits. Disputes would be settled not with bullets but with votes. It was radical, even unthinkable, a mafia governed by order, not chaos. The old dons mocked his ideas, calling them childish dreams. But Luciano knew time was on his side. The city was growing younger, faster, and more American by the day. The new generation, men born or raised in the U.S., had no emotional attachment to Sicily's feuds. They were ambitious, pragmatic, and impatient. They didn't want to serve, they wanted to lead. And Luciano would become their leader. In public he still smiled, still bowed to his superiors, still played the role of loyal soldier. But behind closed doors he was setting the stage for a quiet revolution. Every deal, every alliance, every betrayal he witnessed under Mafia became a lesson in how not to rule. He learned that leadership wasn't about demanding respect. It was about commanding it through competence, fairness, and fear in equal measure. As the tension between the old world and the new grew, the underworld teetered on the edge of civil war. Rival factions, one loyal to Mafia, the other to Salvatore Maranzano, the Sicilian newcomer from Castellamare del Golfo, began to clash violently across New York. The mustache Pete saw it as a war for honor. Luciano saw it as an opportunity. He was now in his early 30s, wealthy, connected, and feared. But deep down he knew he was still just a soldier in someone else's war. The Mafia was on the verge of imploding, and if he didn't act soon, his dream of modernization would die with it. Luciano began to think the unthinkable, that for the Mafia to survive the old world would have to die first. He wasn't ready to strike yet, but his mind was already making moves. Every smile at Mafia's table, every toast of loyalty, every promise of brotherhood was a disguise for what was coming. The young wolf had learned everything he could from the dinosaurs, their habits, their weaknesses, their arrogance. Soon he would use that knowledge to destroy them. By 1930 New York was a city at war, not a war fought in trenches or with uniforms, but in backrooms, alleys, and restaurants that reeked of cigar smoke and paranoia. The streets whispered two names with equal dread: Joe the Boss Mafia and Salvatore Maranzano. Both were powerful, both were ruthless, and both claimed to be the rightful king of the Italian underworld. Their feud, the Castellamarese War, would become one of the bloodiest power struggles in American mafia history. It was a war that would kill dozens, reshape the criminal world, and test every instinct Luciano had ever learned about power, survival, and betrayal. The war's roots stretched deep into old Sicilian rivalries. Maranzano, who had recently arrived from Castellamare del Golfo, saw himself as a purist, a man of tradition bringing true mafia honor to America. He viewed Mafia as corrupt, greedy, and unfit to lead. Mafia, meanwhile, saw Maranzano as a foreign intruder trying to steal what he had built. What began as a struggle for influence quickly became a full-scale civil war, splitting the Italian underworld into two camps. Every corner of New York, from the Bronx to Brooklyn, became a battlefield. Luciano, caught in the middle, understood something the old bosses did not. This war was madness. Every death, every assassination, weakened the Mafia's control over its own empire. Police pressure increased, profits dwindled, and trust evaporated. While Mafia demanded absolute loyalty, Luciano saw opportunity. He was tired of watching ancient grudges destroy business. This war wasn't about honor, it was about ego. An ego he knew could be exploited. At first Luciano stayed loyal. Outwardly he was Mafia's right-hand man, the charming diplomat who negotiated truces and smoothed over conflicts. But privately he began reaching out to Maranzano's side. He was playing both ends of the game, collecting information, gauging strength, and waiting for the right moment. It wasn't treachery for its own sake, it was strategy. To Luciano both bosses were obstacles. The old guard's war had to burn itself out before something new could be built from the ashes. The violence was relentless. Drive-by shootings became routine. Bodies were found in barber chairs, cars, stairwells, sometimes mutilated, sometimes left as warnings. Every restaurant meeting was a potential death trap. Soldiers switched sides, alliances dissolved overnight. Even the police, often bribed to look away, couldn't ignore the mounting chaos. Newspapers called it a gangland purge, but inside the underworld, it felt more like a reckoning. Luciano's personal transformation during this period was striking. Gone was the ambitious street kid trying to impress his superiors. Now he was cold, deliberate, and unreadable. His closest friends, like Meyer Lansky, warned him that his double-dealing was dangerous, but Luciano saw no other way. "If I don't make peace," he reportedly told Lansky, "there'll be nothing left to rule." It wasn't survival he was after anymore, it was control. Then came the turning point, the infamous betrayal of Joe Masuria. By 1931, the war had dragged on for nearly 2 years. Both sides were exhausted, bleeding money and manpower. Luciano had gained Maranzano's trust, who promised him peace and shared power if he helped end the conflict. The message was clear: Masuria had to die. Luciano's decision wasn't made in haste. It was a moral and psychological break, the moment he chose the future over the past. He arranged a meeting with Masuria at Coney Island's Nuova Villa Tomorrow restaurant, under the guise of discussing a truce. On April 15, 1931, the two men dined together, Luciano calm, charming and silent about what was to come. As Masuria ate, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. The moment he left the table, gunfire erupted. 3 men, Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia and Joe Adonis, stormed in, firing multiple rounds. Masuria died instantly, a cigar still burning between his fingers, a deck of cards scattered before him. Luciano returned moments later, expressionless. He'd orchestrated it perfectly, the crime scene neat, the message clear. The old boss was dead. The old order was ending. For the underworld, Masuria's death was shocking, but also liberating. Many saw Luciano as a hero, the man brave enough to do what everyone else feared, kill a mafia boss. Maranzano, however, saw something different. He saw ambition that needed to be contained. He immediately declared himself the new boss of bosses, and began reorganizing the mafia along rigid lines. 5 families, each with its own territory, paying homage to him. On the surface it looked like order. In truth, it was just another form of dictatorship, the very thing Luciano wanted to abolish. At first, Luciano played along. He attended Maranzano's meetings, flattered him, even accepted a position as his second in command. But behind his polite nods, he was quietly building something else. He admired Maranzano's structure but despised his arrogance. Maranzano lectured the younger men about Roman emperors, calling himself Caesar. He referred to Luciano and his peers as Americanized punks. That arrogance was his downfall. Luciano realized that he had traded one tyrant for another. The war, he understood, would never truly end until the old world, all of it, was wiped away. And so he began to plan again. The lessons he had learned under Masuria, patience, timing, betrayal, would now be turned against Maranzano himself. In retrospect, the Castellamarese War was more than a power struggle. It was a generational revolution. It was the clash between Sicily and America, between tradition and modernity, between pride and pragmatism. The streets of New York became the crucible in which the modern mafia was forged. Luciano didn't just survive it, he mastered it. When the final body fell and the smoke cleared, the mafia was no longer a loose collection of warring clans. It was a machine, disciplined, profitable and ready to be led. And at its center stood a man who had learned the ultimate lesson of power, that to build a new world you first have to destroy the old one. For Luciano, the war wasn't just a victory. It was a transformation. The street kid from the Lower East Side had become the architect of a new order. The mafia had entered its modern age, and Lucky Luciano had become its silent kingmaker. When the gunfire that killed Joe Masuria faded into silence, Lucky Luciano stood on the edge of history. He had survived the bloodiest mafia war America had ever seen, not through brute force but through calculation. Yet what came next would define him far more than what had come before. In 1931, Luciano made a decision that would change the face of organized crime forever: to destroy the last remnants of the old world and build a new order from its ashes. Salvatore Maranzano believed he had won. With Masuria gone, he crowned himself Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of bosses. He strutted through New York's underworld like a Roman emperor, dressing in expensive suits, lecturing his men about Julius Caesar and military strategy. He created a structure for the mafia, dividing New York into 5 distinct families: the Lucchese, Bonanno, Professai, Mangano and Luciano families, each with its own hierarchy of boss, underboss and capo regimes. To the outside world, it seemed that Maranzano had brought peace. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Luciano respected the idea of organization but despised Maranzano's obsession with titles and control. The so-called order was just another tyranny, the same arrogance that had doomed the Mustache Petes. Maranzano distrusted the younger generation, calling them unrefined and untrustworthy. He mocked their friendships with Jews and Irishmen, sneered at their American suits and slang. He had inherited Masuria's arrogance and in doing so, signed his own death warrant. Luciano quickly realized that Maranzano was already plotting against him. Informants warned that Maranzano had put out a contract on Luciano and his close associates, including Meyer Lansky and Vito Genovese. The old man had even brought in hired killers, Irish hitmen disguised as detectives, to finish the job. But Luciano had learned well from the war: strike first, strike smart, and never hesitate. On September 10, 1931, the cycle repeated. Luciano arranged a meeting with Maranzano at his office in the Helmsley building on Park Avenue. As Maranzano waited, 4 men entered posing as tax inspectors. They were Luciano's killers, young, clean-cut, and efficient. Moments later, Maranzano lay dead, stabbed and shot multiple times, his empire collapsing in silence. The message was unmistakable: the age of the mustache Pete's was over. In that single act, Luciano achieved what no one else had dared. He had dismantled the Mafia's ancient hierarchy and replaced it with a new model: not a monarchy but a commission. This would be the governing body of organized crime in America, where bosses could meet, negotiate, and resolve disputes without bloodshed. Every family would be autonomous but bound by mutual interest. There would be no boss of bosses, only balance. Luciano had transformed murder into management. To his peers it was genius. To historians, it was the birth of modern organized crime. For Luciano, it was something more personal: the fulfillment of a vision he had carried since his days as a street hustler. A system where respect came not from tradition, but from power earned through intelligence and results. The killings of Masuria and Maranzano marked more than a generational shift. They were symbolic executions, the death of Sicily's shadow over the American Mafia. Luciano's world was American now, multicultural, capitalist, and ruthlessly efficient. The Mafia was no longer a secret society of peasants and vendettas, it was a corporation, and he was its chief executive. When the news spread, the underworld trembled but did not rebel. The violence stopped. The families obeyed the new structure, partly out of fear, partly out of awe. Luciano had not just killed 2 men, he had killed an era. And for the first time, New York's underworld stood united, not under superstition or bloodlines, but under a single idea: profit. In the silence that followed, Luciano finally exhaled. He had risked everything: his life, his allies, his soul, to build something enduring. But even he could not yet see how powerful his creation would become. He had imagined a brotherhood of balance. What he built was an empire of greed that would stretch across continents. Still, in that moment, standing above the city that once spit him out, lucky Luciano had won his private war: the war for respect. With the blood of the old bosses now dry and the smoke of war finally clearing, Luciano's dream began to take form, not in blood-soaked streets, but in boardrooms disguised as backrooms, in whispered conversations over steak dinners and whiskey glasses. New York's 5 families were no longer warring tribes but business divisions within a sprawling criminal syndicate. Luciano, though not formally crowned, had become the most powerful man in organized crime, the quiet force everyone deferred to, the man who balanced fear with respect. But power, as always, came with enemies. And in the delicate ecosystem of the Mafia, even peace was just another form of tension. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to blend cultures and personalities that others saw as incompatible. He didn't just rule through Sicilian traditions, he redefined them. He surrounded himself with a circle of allies who were as ambitious as they were unconventional, men like Meyer Lansky, the cerebral Jewish strategist; Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the hot-tempered enforcer with Hollywood charm; Frank Costello, the political manipulator who knew every cop and politician worth knowing; and Vito Genovese, ruthless, cunning, and always watching. Together they formed the backbone of Luciano's empire, a fusion of intellect, brutality, and diplomacy. This alliance between Italians and Jews was revolutionary. Old-school mobsters despised it, believing that mixing bloodlines was a violation of Mafia purity. But Luciano saw the world differently. Money had no ethnicity, and loyalty came not from birth but from shared ambition. Lansky especially became indispensable. He was the architect behind much of Luciano's financial network, a man who could turn bootlegging profits into legitimate-looking investments and who understood that the future of organized crime wasn't in street rackets, it was in control of systems. Together, Luciano and Lansky began transforming crime into capitalism. Prohibition was ending, but they had already prepared for its death. Gambling, narcotics, unions, and prostitution, these became the new engines of profit. They diversified, investing in hotels, construction, and docks. Everything from the bartender pouring whiskey to the longshoreman unloading crates at the harbor could be touched by their influence. And behind it all was the commission, the Mafia's invisible government, ensuring that disputes were handled quietly, efficiently, and without the chaos of the old days. But peace in the Mafia was always fragile. Beneath the polished veneer of order, ambition simmered like a fuse waiting for a spark. Vito Genovese, once Luciano's trusted lieutenant, began plotting from the shadows. He admired Luciano, even feared him, but envy gnawed at him. Genovese didn't want to be second. He wanted to be the one calling the shots. When Luciano's influence spread to Chicago, Cleveland, and Havana, Genovese began quietly building his own alliances, waiting for a moment of weakness. That weakness came in the form of law enforcement pressure. The early 1930s saw a surge of attention from politicians eager to make names for themselves by taking down organized crime. Reformers like Thomas E. Dewey, an ambitious prosecutor with a flair for headlines, began targeting vice operations, gambling, drugs, and especially prostitution. Dewey's crusade would soon collide directly with Luciano's empire, but for now, it was only a rumble in the distance. Meanwhile, the commission extended its reach. Luciano established connections with Al Capone's Chicago outfit, merging East Coast intelligence with Midwest muscle. He sent emissaries to Cleveland, Detroit, and New Orleans, not to demand tribute but to form partnerships. He envisioned a syndicate that ran like a corporate federation, where each city operated semi-independently but answered to the same invisible code. It was a criminal version of the United Nations, pragmatic, calculated, and ruthlessly efficient. Luciano's strength was his ability to adapt. Where old Mafia leaders ruled with fear, he ruled with balance. He listened, negotiated, and only resorted to violence when necessary. This made him both admired and feared, a rare combination. Men like Lansky called him a businessman with a gun. To his enemies, that was precisely what made him dangerous. But the irony of power is that the higher you climb, the fewer people you can trust. Luciano's network thrived on loyalty, yet betrayal lurked everywhere. In jealous subordinates, in rival families, even in the political connections he thought he owned. The very alliances that had built his empire were slowly becoming the cracks that could destroy it. Still, in those years, from 1931 to 1935, Lucky Luciano stood at the peak of his reign. The underworld was organized, the profits endless, the violence minimal. He was the invisible king of America's hidden economy. Politicians shook his hand at night and denounced him by day. Broadway stars dined at his tables. Journalists wrote about him with awe and fear. And through it all, Luciano seemed untouchable. He walked through the city he once begged from as a child, now its unacknowledged ruler. Every speakeasy, every nightclub, every gambling den was a piece of his kingdom. His allies were powerful, his enemies cautious, his name whispered with a mix of admiration and terror. But as history would soon show, the empire Luciano built on respect and intelligence would be tested by something far more unpredictable than bullets or rival gangsters. Ambition within his own ranks and a prosecutor with nothing to lose. The allies who had once raised him would soon become his greatest risks, and the enemies he thought he'd conquered would find new ways to strike. In the world Luciano built, peace was never permanent, only the calm before the next betrayal. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire seemed untouchable. The Mafia had never been so organized, so profitable, so invisible. He had turned chaos into structure and crime into a business model. The commission met quietly to settle disputes. Money flowed from illegal gambling dens, brothels, and labor rackets into legitimate-looking enterprises. Luciano's power reached beyond New York, into Chicago, Havana, and even the Caribbean. Yet behind the smooth machinery of this new order, a storm was brewing, a hidden war that would strike not from rival mobsters, but from the halls of justice, the headlines of newspapers, and the restless ambitions of those closest to him. The first signs of danger came from an ambitious young prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. Sharp, relentless, and theatrical, Dewey saw crime not just as a legal problem but as a political opportunity. He wanted to be the man who brought down organized crime in New York, and the man who could use that fame to climb into higher office. For Dewey, Luciano wasn't just another criminal. He was the symbol of everything corrupt in American society. If he could take down the man the press called King of the Underworld, it would make him a national hero. But taking down Luciano wasn't easy. The boss operated like a shadow. He never handled money directly, never signed documents, and rarely issued orders in person. He insulated himself behind layers of intermediaries. His businesses were technically legitimate. His subordinates were loyal and silent. Dewey's early investigations into gambling and racketeering led nowhere. The public meanwhile saw Luciano as almost mythic, a man who moved freely between politicians, celebrities, and the underworld. He was the kind of figure who could make the law seem powerless, and that made Dewey furious. Then Dewey found a weak spot: prostitution. The sex trade was the most visible, the most scandalous, and the most emotionally charged industry under Luciano's influence. It wasn't the Mafia's biggest moneymaker, but it was its most vulnerable. Dewey began rounding up madams and prostitutes, offering deals in exchange for testimony. Most refused. The code of omerta ran deep even outside the Mafia. But eventually one woman, Cokie Flo Brown, cracked. She and others claimed that Luciano's men controlled hundreds of brothels across the city, collecting protection money and managing operations from the shadows. The case was flimsy, but Dewey was a showman. He built it into a moral crusade, turning the newspapers into weapons. Headlines screamed of Lucky Luciano's vice empire and the devil's playground. The public, exhausted by the depression and eager for villains, believed every word. Dewey's team raided brothels, arrested Luciano's associates, and painted a portrait of a man living off the exploitation of women. It was part truth, part propaganda, but it worked. Luciano, who had survived bullets and betrayals, now found himself hunted by the law. In April 1936, he fled to Hot Springs, Arkansas, hoping to lay low while his lawyers arranged protection. But Dewey's reach extended far beyond New York. Local authorities, pressured by federal agents and hungry for reward money, arrested him at a hotel spa. The untouchable gangster was suddenly in handcuffs. Newspapers called it the capture of America's most powerful criminal. Luciano was extradited to New York to stand trial. The spectacle that followed was unlike anything the Mafia had seen. Dewey turned the courtroom into a stage, parading witnesses who painted Luciano as the mastermind of a vast prostitution syndicate. The evidence was circumstantial, the testimony contradictory, but the performance was impeccable. Dewey's voice thundered through the courtroom. This man has made millions from the degradation of women. Luciano's defense team argued that their client was a businessman, not a pimp, that the state had no direct proof tying him to prostitution. But the verdict had been decided long before the jury sat down. Dewey's crusade had already won in the court of public opinion. When the judge finally read the sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison, the audience gasped. Dewey had done the impossible. He had brought down Lucky Luciano. Behind bars, the hidden war took on a new form. Luciano's enemies on the outside, rivals like Vito Genovese, began circling. Genovese had long coveted Luciano's throne, and now, with the boss locked away, he began consolidating power. He took over many of Luciano's operations, forging new alliances and spreading whispers that Lucky's time was over. Even some allies began to doubt whether Luciano could ever come back. But Luciano was not finished. From within the walls of Clinton Correctional Facility, he began to reorganize. He sent coded messages through lawyers and visitors, ensuring that the commission continued to operate. Frank Costello acted as his voice in New York, while Lansky and Siegel managed investments elsewhere. Even imprisoned, Luciano retained an eerie kind of control, the mark of a man whose influence came not from presence but from design. The media painted him as broken, but those who visited described something else: calm, discipline, patience. Luciano knew that every empire eventually faced its reckoning, and every reckoning offered a new beginning. He studied, read, wrote letters, and waited. Outside, the world was changing. The Mafia was expanding into Las Vegas, Cuba, and beyond. The structure he had built was thriving even without him. Dewey, meanwhile, rode his victory to national fame. But within the underworld, many saw his triumph as hollow. The Mafia didn't crumble, it adapted. Luciano's imprisonment didn't destroy the syndicate, it only made it more discreet. For every headline that declared the end of organized crime, another deal was being made in silence. The war between law and the underworld wasn't over, it had simply gone underground. And in that underground war, Luciano was still a general, watching, waiting, and planning his return. Because in the world he created, power didn't vanish when you lost your freedom. It only changed shape. Luciano's arrest in 1936 was supposed to mark the end of an era, the final chapter of the man who had once ruled America's criminal underworld with unmatched precision and intelligence. But in truth, it was only the beginning of a new battle, a quiet, psychological war waged not in alleys or boardrooms, but inside prison walls. For Lucky Luciano, the fall was brutal, not just because of the physical confinement but because it struck at the very heart of what he valued most: control, respect, and reputation. When the prison gates closed behind him, the sound echoed like a final judgment. Reporters wrote gleefully that the king of the underworld has lost his crown. But those who truly knew Luciano understood that his story was far from over. He had been caged before, by poverty, by fear, by the old world bosses he'd destroyed. Every time he had adapted. This time would be no different. Luciano was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, a maximum security prison so remote it was nicknamed Little Siberia. It was a place designed to break men. Inside its cold, gray walls, prisoners marched in silence, spoke in whispers, and lived under constant surveillance. Yet even here Luciano refused to be ordinary. Guards noticed that he never lost his composure. He read newspapers daily, kept a tidy cell, and maintained an air of calm that unsettled even the warden. But the true battlefield was outside, where his empire stood at a crossroads. Without Luciano's guiding hand, the Mafia risked slipping back into chaos. Frank Costello stepped in as his de facto successor, running day-to-day operations and keeping the commission stable. Costello was the perfect front, smooth, political, and nonviolent, the kind of man who could keep the peace with both mobsters and senators. Meanwhile, Vito Genovese, who had fled to Italy to avoid prosecution for murder, began maneuvering for his own comeback. He wrote letters, sent messages, and bided his time, waiting for the moment when Luciano's grip might finally weaken. Inside prison, Luciano became a paradox, a prisoner with more influence than most free men. Using his network of lawyers, family members, and bribed guards, he communicated regularly with his lieutenants. He received coded letters written in the language of family updates or business correspondence. The farm is doing well, might mean the casinos were turning profits. The uncles are quarreling, might signal trouble among the families. Even the warden seemed to understand that Luciano's influence extended beyond the bars, and there was little anyone could do to stop it. But despite his calm exterior, the psychological toll was immense. For a man who once ruled New York, prison was a humiliation he could not fully hide. He missed the nightlife, the suits, the sense of power. He kept up appearances, exercising regularly, reading philosophy and history, Machiavelli, Caesar, and Sun Tzu, as if studying the nature of control itself. "They can take my body," he reportedly told a visitor, "but they'll never take my mind." In the world outside, Dewey continued to celebrate his victory. He was promoted to district attorney and later ran for governor, his campaign posters bearing slogans about law, order, and integrity. But even as he rose in politics, whispers persisted. Whispers that Luciano's conviction had been built more on ambition than on truth. Several of the key witnesses in the prostitution case recanted or contradicted their own testimony. One even admitted she had been pressured by the prosecution to name Luciano as the mastermind. By then it didn't matter. The damage was done and Lucky remained behind bars. Still, power has a strange way of bending rules around those who understand it. Luciano's good behavior earned him privileges, better meals, visitors, even the occasional private conversation with guards and officials. Slowly he built influence inside the prison itself. Other inmates treated him with a mix of reverence and fear, calling him the boss even there. He became a mediator in prison disputes, helped smuggle in contraband, and used his resources to make life easier for those loyal to him. In a place designed to crush identity, he had created hierarchy, and placed himself at the top once again. Meanwhile, the outside world was changing fast. The Great Depression was giving way to recovery, and the winds of another global conflict were rising. By 1939, Europe was at war and the United States was inching closer to involvement. The Mafia, always opportunistic, began exploiting wartime shortages and black markets. Even in prison, Luciano was kept informed. Through coded correspondence with Lansky and Costello, he stayed in touch with the syndicate's expanding operations, especially in Havana, where Lansky was laying the groundwork for what would become the Mafia's Caribbean haven. But the fall from grace still haunted Luciano. The newspapers that once praised his cunning now mocked his downfall. Some of his old allies, eager to preserve their reputations, distanced themselves. "Lucky's finished," one rival said. "The commission belongs to new blood now." Yet those who understood Luciano's mind knew better. He had built an organization designed to survive without him. It was his greatest insurance policy, and his greatest revenge. In time, even the government would come to realize that locking up Luciano hadn't neutralized him. It had only forced him to evolve. He became something new, a strategist in exile, a ghost pulling strings from the shadows. His empire didn't die with his imprisonment. It adapted, diversified, and waited for its architect to return. By 1942, that chance would come, from the most unlikely of sources. As America plunged into World War II, the U.S. Navy found itself facing a problem it could not solve through laws or politics. A problem that would lead them straight to a man in a prison cell, the same man they had once sworn to destroy. The hidden war Luciano had been fighting in silence was about to spill into the light, and this time he would find himself working not against the United States, but for it. The year was 1942. The world was at war, and for the first time in history the United States found itself vulnerable not only on foreign shores but at home, deep in its own harbors. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking American ships within sight of the East Coast. Rumors spread that Nazi saboteurs had infiltrated the docks of New York. Warehouses burned mysteriously, cargo disappeared, and whispers circulated that the Mafia-controlled longshoremen's unions might be involved, whether through negligence, greed, or subversion. The U.S. Navy was desperate. They needed control of the docks, security in the harbors, and cooperation from the men who worked there. But those men didn't answer to the government, they answered to the Mafia. And the Mafia, as every official knew, answered to one man, even if he was behind bars: Charles "Lucky" Luciano. What followed would become one of the strangest alliances in American history, a secret partnership between organized crime and the U.S. government. The Navy launched Operation Underworld, an initiative to secure the New York waterfront through the cooperation of mob-controlled unions. And the man chosen to make contact with Luciano was Meyer Lansky, his trusted friend and advisor. Lansky, though Jewish and not a made man, had long been Luciano's bridge between worlds. When the government approached him, he saw both danger and opportunity. At first the idea seemed insane. How could the United States, in the middle of a global war, work with the country's most infamous gangster? But pragmatism won out. America couldn't afford ideological purity when its ships were being torched. So, in hushed meetings, intermediaries from naval intelligence began coordinating with Lansky, and through him, with Luciano. From his prison cell, Luciano offered cooperation. In exchange, he wanted better treatment and eventually a chance for release. Using his influence, he sent word to Mafia-controlled dockworkers to protect military shipments, report any sabotage, and ensure that ships sailed safely. And remarkably, it worked. Fire stopped. The flow of cargo stabilized. Even whispers of Nazi infiltration disappeared. But Luciano's help didn't end there. In 1943, when the Allies prepared to invade Sicily, they faced another challenge: gathering intelligence about the terrain, the local population, and potential resistance. Once again, naval intelligence turned to Luciano. His contacts in Sicily, built over decades through Mafia networks, became an invaluable source of information. Through these connections, American troops received maps, guides, and assurances that local mafiosi would cooperate with the invasion. When U.S. forces landed on Sicilian beaches, they encountered far less resistance than expected. Some historians would later argue that the Mafia's support, orchestrated through Luciano's quiet influence, had helped secure victory in the Mediterranean. For Luciano, it was a turning point, a second chance disguised as patriotism. He understood that this alliance could be his redemption. When the war ended, his lawyers moved quickly, arguing that his wartime assistance had directly contributed to national security. The press, sensing a story of irony and intrigue, dubbed it Lucky's Secret War. In 1946, the efforts bore fruit. After a series of private hearings and quiet political deals, Governor Thomas Dewey, the very man who had once sent Luciano to prison, commuted his sentence. It was a decision born of political calculation as much as gratitude. Dewey wanted to appear tough but fair, pragmatic but merciful. He announced that Luciano would be released for services rendered to the United States government during wartime, but with one condition: he would be deported to Italy immediately. When Luciano walked out of prison on February 2, 1946, reporters crowded around, shouting questions. He smiled faintly but said nothing. His once slick hair was grayer, his face leaner, but his eyes still sharp. He had served 9 years, and somehow, instead of fading into obscurity, he had turned his incarceration into a victory. Even his enemies couldn't help but admire the irony. The government had freed the man they once called the devil of the underworld. Before his deportation, Luciano spent one last night in America, at Ellis Island, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. The city glittered in the distance, a ghost of his former kingdom. For a moment, perhaps, he felt both pride and loss. He had built that empire brick by brick, from the gutters to the penthouses. Now it belonged to others. On February 10, 1946, he boarded the SS Laura Keene, bound for Naples. As the ship pulled away, Luciano stood at the rail, watching the lights of New York fade into the horizon. He had returned power to the government, aided a war effort and regained his freedom, but at a price. He was exiled from the city he had once ruled, from the life he had built, from the very world that defined him. Yet, as history would soon show, exile would not mean silence. The man who had organized the American Mafia was not done shaping its future. From the shores of Italy, Lucky Luciano would begin again, not as a king but as a ghost pulling strings across oceans. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship in Naples in 1946, the Mediterranean sun was warm, but the welcome was cold. He had returned to the land of his birth, yet he was a stranger in it, a man without a home, a king without a kingdom. America had expelled him, and Italy, still reeling from war and poverty, didn't know what to make of this legendary gangster who had helped the Allies win their campaign. The newspapers called him El Americano, half with admiration, half with suspicion. Luciano was under heavy police surveillance from the moment he arrived. The Italian authorities, under pressure from the U.S., kept him on a short leash. Every phone call was monitored, every letter inspected, every movement noted. He was technically free, but in reality he was living in a gilded cage, watched, restricted, and isolated from the empire he had built across the Atlantic. But for Luciano, control was not about proximity, it was about communication, influence, and patience. And those he still had in abundance. Almost immediately, Luciano began to re-establish contact with his old associates. He reached out to Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Vito Genovese, who by now had returned to New York after years in Italy. Costello was holding the commission together, Lansky was expanding into Havana's casino scene, and Genovese was quietly maneuvering to reclaim his place in the Mafia's upper ranks. Through coded messages, visiting couriers, and carefully worded letters, Luciano made his presence felt. Though separated by an ocean, he remained an invisible hand in the organization he had created. It was around this time that the Mafia's focus shifted south, to Cuba. Meyer Lansky, ever the strategist, saw Havana as the perfect replacement for the lost golden age of New York nightlife. Gambling was legal, the government was corruptible, and the city was a tropical paradise for American tourists. Lansky began opening luxury casinos and hotels, turning Havana into a criminal Eden. And behind the curtain, Lucky Luciano's name began to reappear. In 1946, a secret meeting took place at the Hotel Nacional in Havana, a gathering that would later be called the Havana Conference. Dozens of America's most powerful mobsters attended, including Lansky, Genovese, Santo Trafficante, and Frank Costello. Officially, it was a social event, but everyone knew the truth. It was about the future of organized crime, and about the return of Lucky Luciano. Luciano had managed to obtain a special visa to travel from Italy to Cuba under the guise of business. When he arrived in Havana, it was as if a legend had walked back from the dead. He checked into the Hotel Nacional under an alias, surrounded by bodyguards and mystery. The moment he entered the conference hall, the room fell silent. Every man there knew who truly ran the Mafia, even if the newspapers didn't. The meeting was both nostalgic and strategic. Luciano congratulated his old allies, praised Lansky's work in Cuba, and discussed expanding operations in narcotics, gambling, and unions. He also sought to restore discipline within the ranks, reminding everyone that the commission was not a democracy of greed, it was a system of order. "Respect keeps us alive," he said. "Forget that and we'll all end up in the same grave." But not everyone welcomed his return. Vito Genovese, ever the opportunist, saw Luciano's re-emergence as a threat. He had waited years for Luciano's absence to become permanent. Now the man he once called boss was back, commanding attention and loyalty. Genovese began plotting again, whispering to allies in New York that Luciano was weak, that his influence had faded, that he no longer understood the modern Mafia. The seeds of betrayal were being planted once more. Luciano's return to prominence, however, didn't go unnoticed by the U.S. government. Within weeks, word reached Washington that the deported king of the underworld was in Havana, holding meetings with America's most dangerous criminals. Pressure mounted on Cuba to expel him. The U.S. threatened to cut off trade and diplomatic ties unless Luciano was sent back to Italy. The Cuban president caved. After only a few months of freedom, Luciano was arrested by Cuban authorities and deported once again to Naples. Back in Italy, he resumed his quiet exile. But by now, his influence stretched farther than any border could contain. His network extended from New York to Havana to Marseille, where the French connection was beginning to supply heroin to America through Mafia channels. Many historians believe Luciano played a role, directly or indirectly, in facilitating that trade, though he never admitted it. Still, the life of exile took its toll. The older he grew, the more the contradictions of his existence haunted him. He had power yet no freedom, wealth yet no peace. He was respected yet constantly watched. Police raids became routine. Informants shadowed his every move. The Italian authorities labeled him a dangerous international criminal. The Americans saw him as a ghost they couldn't fully destroy. Luciano, however, maintained his composure. He lived quietly in Naples, occasionally traveling under false names to meet with contacts in Rome or Palermo. He dined in modest restaurants, spent his days reading, and entertained visitors who came seeking advice or blessings. Young gangsters from Sicily, Corsica, and even the United States. They all saw him as a living legend, the man who had once united chaos into order. By the 1950s, Luciano's health began to decline. Years of stress, imprisonment, and constant surveillance had worn him down. But even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp. He spoke often of legacy, of how history would remember him, not as a criminal but as a builder. "I gave them structure," he once said, "and they turned it into greed. That's not my crime, that's human nature." Despite exile, Lucky Luciano had managed something extraordinary. He had maintained relevance and power across continents, without ever setting foot in the country he once ruled. He had turned his name into an institution, one that could survive without his presence. A ghost empire run on fear, loyalty, and memory. He was no longer the brash kid from the Lower East Side, nor the ruthless Don of New York. He was something else now, a myth in motion, watching from afar as the empire he built continued to evolve. In a world that had tried to bury him, Luciano had become immortal in the only way that mattered to him, by remaining indispensable. By the early 1950s, Lucky Luciano was living out his exile in Naples. Not as a prisoner but as a man trapped between memory and legend. The once vibrant streets of New York were far away, yet every morning when he looked out from his apartment balcony over the Bay of Naples, he could almost hear the city that had made him. He was 50 years old, with thinning hair and tired eyes, but the same calm authority that had once silenced rooms full of killers. In Italy he was watched by the police, tolerated by politicians, and adored by the new generation of underworld figures who saw him as both a teacher and a ghost of the old ways. Luciano's influence hadn't vanished, it had simply changed form. He had become a symbol, the founder of the American Mafia, the man who had given chaos its code. His name still carried power in the gambling halls of Havana, in the backrooms of New York, and in the smuggling networks that stretched from Marseille to Montreal. Yet inside, Luciano was a man caught between two worlds. He had once been the architect of a global underworld. Now he lived in modest apartments, writing letters to old friends and watching from afar as others fought for control of his creation. One of those men was Vito Genovese, the very ally who had once betrayed him. After Luciano's deportation, Genovese made his move. He pushed Frank Costello aside, took control of the commission, and declared himself the new boss of bosses, a title Luciano had always rejected. From Naples, Luciano followed these developments with a mixture of disgust and resignation. "They forgot the rules," he said once to a confidant. "It's all greed now. No honor left." The mafia he had built on discipline and cooperation was fracturing into rival factions driven by ego and money. Still, Luciano couldn't fully detach from it. The criminal world was his life's work, his identity. When younger men sought his counsel, Sicilian bosses, Corsican smugglers, even American lieutenants visiting Europe, he welcomed them. Over wine and cigarettes he would talk about structure, about loyalty, about how power should be balanced with respect. To them he was like a retired general, no longer on the battlefield but still commanding reverence from those who fought in his name. But time was catching up. The Italian authorities continued to monitor him, fearful that he might re-establish transatlantic connections. The Americans refused to lift his deportation order. He had no passport, no legal standing, and no real peace. In public, he appeared calm and dignified. In private, he wrestled with the sense that his life had been a grand performance, one that had brought him everything and left him with nothing. In 1957, the underworld he'd founded erupted once again in chaos. The Appalachian Meeting, a massive mafia summit in upstate New York, was raided by police, exposing the mafia's existence to the American public in ways never seen before. The commission, which Luciano had once designed as a secret council, was now national news. The arrest shattered the illusion of invisibility. From Naples, Luciano read about it in the papers and shook his head. "Fools," he muttered. "They forgot the first rule, never let them see you." That same year, Luciano's own life began to fade into quieter days. He spent time by the sea, reminiscing with old friends, sometimes dining with movie producers who wanted to tell his story. One of them, an Italian-American filmmaker named Martin Gosch, convinced Luciano to collaborate on a memoir. Luciano saw it as a chance to control the narrative, to tell his story in his own words, not as a monster but as a man shaped by circumstance. In January 1962, Luciano agreed to meet Gosch at the Naples airport to finalize their deal. He dressed neatly, wearing a gray suit and a soft hat, the same understated elegance he had always preferred. As he walked through the terminal, witnesses later recalled that he looked calm, almost happy. After years of exile, it seemed he had found a way to tell his truth. But fate, as it often had in Luciano's life, intervened suddenly and without mercy. Moments after greeting Gosch, Luciano clutched his chest and collapsed. A heart attack, massive and final. He died instantly, surrounded by startled bystanders and police officers who had shadowed him for years. The man who had outwitted gangsters, governments, and wars was gone in an instant. He was 64 years old. The irony of his death wasn't lost on those who knew him. Luciano had survived assassination attempts, prison, betrayal, and exile, only to die on the day he tried to explain himself to the world. The authorities who had watched him so closely rushed to the scene, seizing his papers and the manuscript drafts he had been preparing. When news of his death reached America, reactions were divided. To law enforcement, it was the end of an era, the passing of a symbol of corruption and organized crime. To the underworld, it was something deeper, the death of the man who had built the foundation they still stood on. In New York, old-timers raised glasses in quiet bars. In Havana, whispers spread through the casinos he had helped inspire. Even in Sicily, the Don spoke his name with respect. Luciano's body was eventually brought back to New York, the city that had made him. Thousands came to his funeral, gangsters, politicians, curious citizens. His casket was carried through the streets of the Bronx, draped not in flags but in silence. And as it was lowered into the ground, those who understood his story saw it not as an ending, but as the closing of a circle. Lucky Luciano, the street kid from the Lower East Side, the architect of the American Mafia, the exile who never stopped pulling strings, was finally home. The death of Lucky Luciano in 1962 marked the end of a man, but not the end of his influence. In truth, his passing symbolized the conclusion of one era and the quiet beginning of another. The empire he built, disciplined, structured, and global, continued to thrive even as his name faded from headlines. To the underworld, Luciano was not just a historical figure, he was the architect of a philosophy. His rules, his vision, and his ruthless pragmatism had transformed disorganized street crime into a multinational enterprise. He had professionalized the Mafia, turning it from a collection of feuding street gangs into a corporate syndicate with its own system of governance, one that would outlast him by decades. In the years following his death, law enforcement agencies struggled to understand how deeply his ideas had penetrated every level of organized crime. The Commission, his most enduring creation, continued to operate in secret. It was more than a governing body, it was a symbol of order, a criminal parliament that mediated disputes and preserved peace between families. Luciano's design had ensured that no single boss could dominate unchecked. The Mafia, for all its brutality, had a strange kind of democracy. And for a time it worked. The five families of New York thrived throughout the 1960s and 70s, extending their reach into politics, labor unions, and corporate America. Even as new faces replaced old ones, every major decision still echoed Luciano's original blueprint. But his legacy extended beyond structure. Psychologically, Luciano represented something far deeper, a portrait of the American dream corrupted and redefined. He was an immigrant who had climbed from poverty to power, from the slums of the Lower East Side to the penthouses of Manhattan. In another life he might have been a CEO or a politician. Instead, he used the tools available to him, cunning, charisma, and violence, to build his own empire. His rise was a mirror held up to America itself. Ambition without morality, success without legitimacy. He showed that power in any form obeys the same laws: control the flow of money, manage loyalty, and eliminate weakness. Even his enemies couldn't ignore his influence. Governor Thomas Dewey, the man who once imprisoned him, later admitted privately that Luciano's methods had forced law enforcement to evolve. The concept of organized crime task forces, interagency cooperation and long-term intelligence operations all emerged from the government's efforts to dismantle the system Luciano created. In a way, he had shaped not only the criminal world but also the world built to destroy it. Culturally, Luciano became mythologized, a figure halfway between villain and visionary. Films, novels, and documentaries portrayed him as the quintessential mob boss, intelligent, disciplined, and strangely dignified. Unlike Al Capone, who had been flamboyant and reckless, Luciano's power lay in invisibility. He taught his men that true strength was silence, that leadership was not about fear but about respect. This idea would echo through popular culture, inspiring countless fictional characters, from Don Corleone in The Godfather to Tony Soprano. The archetype of the gentleman gangster, cool and calculating, was Luciano's enduring contribution to the world's imagination. Yet, for all his sophistication, Luciano's story remains one of profound irony. He sought respect, but his life was defined by exile. He built an empire but died alone in an airport terminal. He wanted legitimacy, to be seen as more than a criminal, but history would always remember him as the father of organized crime. Still, perhaps that was his form of immortality. Few men could shape the moral fabric of two nations, Italy and America, and leave a legacy that blurred the lines between justice and corruption, between order and chaos. In the decades after his death, the world Luciano created began to unravel. The FBI, empowered by new laws and surveillance technologies, launched relentless attacks against the Mafia. The RICO Act in the 1970s dismantled many of the institutions he had built. The old rules of silence, the omerta, began to crumble as mobsters turned informant to save themselves. The Mafia that once ran on loyalty and discipline devolved into paranoia and betrayal. It was in many ways the inevitable collapse of Luciano's empire. No man can build a perfect system in an imperfect world. But even in its decline, the echoes of Luciano's design remained. Modern organized crime, from the cartels of Latin America to the syndicates of Eastern Europe, operates on principles that trace back to him: hierarchy, networks, and balance through fear. His playbook became universal. When journalists or criminologists analyze global crime today, they are, knowingly or not, analyzing Luciano's legacy. Perhaps the most striking aspect of his story is not what he did, but how he did it. Luciano understood psychology better than most men of his era. He realized that loyalty could be manufactured, fear could be managed, and morality could be reshaped if the incentives were right. He turned the human mind into a tool of control. His empire was not built on brute force alone, but on the manipulation of perception. To his men, he was fair but unyielding. To his enemies, invisible yet omnipresent. That balance between power and restraint is what made him different. In the end, Lucky Luciano's legacy is one of contradiction. He was both destroyer and creator, criminal and visionary, villain and patriot. His life is a case study in the nature of power, how it seduces, corrupts, and isolates those who wield it. He sought respect in a world that refused to give it freely, and in the process, he forced that world to reckon with its own hypocrisy. More than 6 decades after his death, his shadow still lingers, in the mythology of organized crime, in the stories that fill our screens, and in the unending fascination with men who build empires from nothing. The streets may no longer whisper his name, but the system he built still hums in the background of every tale of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal. Lucky Luciano may have died in exile, but history remembers him not as a man cast out, rather as the man who taught the underworld how to rule itself. The story of Lucky Luciano does not end with his death. It lingers like cigarette smoke in a dim backroom, refusing to fade. His life was not simply a chronicle of crime, it was a study of ambition, power, and the price of control. To understand Luciano is to understand the tension between order and chaos, between the need to be respected and the fear of being forgotten. His empire was not made of stone or steel but of people. Men who followed him not because they had to, but because they believed he understood something about the world that others didn't. And in many ways he did. Luciano's genius was not in brutality, others had that. It was in his ability to see systems where others saw street fights. He took the violent, tribal world of early mafia gangs and built from it a structure that mirrored modern corporations. His rules were simple: no senseless killings, no wars without purpose, and above all, no boss above the commission. It was an act of criminal statesmanship, a paradoxical vision that brought peace through fear, democracy through dictatorship. He was, in the purest sense, a realist in a world ruled by emotion. And yet, beneath the control and composure, there was always a human story, that of a boy from the slums of Sicily who wanted to be more than his circumstances. His early life, marked by hunger, bullying, and humiliation, shaped everything that came after. He didn't crave wealth for its own sake, he craved dignity, respect, the right to walk through a city that had once mocked him and command it without saying a word. In this, Luciano was not unlike many men of his time, immigrants who came to America chasing dreams, only to find that the system was rigged against them. He just found another way to win. But victory came at a cost. Every empire, no matter how meticulously built, carries the seeds of its own destruction. Luciano's system depended on discipline, and discipline depends on fear. As the generations changed, fear gave way to greed, and respect gave way to arrogance. The men who came after him inherited his structure but not his restraint. They mistook power for invincibility, and the empire he had built began to rot from within. It's a familiar pattern, in politics, in business, in human nature itself. Luciano's story is simply its most vivid illustration. Even in exile, Luciano seemed to understand this truth. He knew that his empire would not last forever, that time would erode everything he had built. That awareness gave him a kind of melancholy wisdom in his later years. He once told a friend, "I made men think they were kings, but I was only building a house of mirrors. Sooner or later it all cracks." Those words capture the essence of his life. A man who created order out of chaos, knowing all the while that chaos would someday reclaim it. Yet his influence transcended crime. Luciano's model, the idea of organizing power through cooperation and balance, found echoes far beyond the underworld. Corporations, intelligence agencies, even political machines borrowed his methods. His insistence on loyalty and structure became the unofficial template for how power sustains itself. The underworld simply reflected the world above it. That was Luciano's quiet revelation. There is no real difference between legal empires and illegal ones, only perception and paperwork. The irony, of course, is that the man who invented modern organized crime wanted, in the end, to be seen as something more. He wanted history to recognize his intelligence, his foresight, even his service during the war. But history, like power, is rarely merciful. It remembers people for what they did, not what they meant. Luciano will always be remembered as the man who built the American Mafia, not as the man who tried to understand the system that made it possible. Still, there's something undeniably human in his search for respect. Behind the headlines, the police files, and the mythology, there was a man who wanted to be understood. He wasn't driven by madness or ideology but by survival, the same force that drives every empire, legal or otherwise. Perhaps that's why his story continues to fascinate. It isn't just about crime. It's about power, how it's built, how it's lost, and how it defines the men who chase it. Today, Luciano's legacy lives on not just in the remnants of organized crime, but in the way we talk about power itself. His story has been retold in films, documentaries, and novels, each version blurring the line between man and myth. To some, he's a villain. To others, a visionary. But maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. Lucky Luciano was not the devil the newspapers made him out to be, nor was he the hero of his own imagination. He was something far more complicated. A man who understood the mechanics of human ambition better than most and used that understanding to carve his name into history. And so, as the curtain falls on his story, what remains is not judgment, but reflection. The same streets that once echoed his footsteps now carry new generations chasing the same dream: power, respect, control. His empire has vanished, but his lesson endures. That power is never owned, only borrowed. That every kingdom, lawful or not, stands only as long as the people within it believe in the illusion of order. In that sense, Lucky Luciano never truly died. His vision still breathes in the shadows of every deal made in secret, every alliance forged in ambition, every balance of loyalty and fear that keeps men in line. He may have been buried in the Bronx, but his ghost remains in every corner where power and morality meet, whispering always that respect is worth any price.